I remember thinking one thing as I stood on my sister's front porch that night. If Marcus realized I wasn't Claire, everything would fall apart. The porch light above me flickered softly, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, and for a moment I just stood there staring at the door, trying to slow down my breathing. My name is Hannah Reed, and the truth is that until a few weeks ago, I never imagined I would pretend to be my own twin sister. But life has a strange way of pushing you into decisions you never thought you'd make. Claire and I had always looked identical. Same pale blonde hair, same blue eyes, same smile that our mom used to say could get us out of any trouble when we were kids growing up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. Back then switching places had been a harmless trick. We'd swap seats in class, confuse our teachers, or show up for each other's part-time jobs just to see if anyone noticed. Most of the time nobody did. But what we were doing now wasn't a childhood prank. This time there was a reason, and it was a reason that had kept me awake for 3 nights straight. The idea started 2 weeks earlier when Claire showed up at my apartment unannounced on a cold Thursday evening. She was standing outside my door with her arms wrapped around herself like she'd forgotten her code, even though it was barely 50 degrees. Claire was always the organized one, the careful one, the sister who had her life together. She had the nice house in a quiet neighborhood about 30 minutes outside the city, the polished kitchen with white cabinets, the kind of life that looked perfect in holiday photos. Or at least that's what I thought. That night she stepped into my apartment and tried to smile, but something about it felt wrong. Claire was never the kind of person who asked for help. In fact, most of the time she insisted she didn't need any. But as we sat at my small kitchen table, she finally said the words that changed everything. She told me that the life everyone thought she had wasn't real. She told me that the man she married, Marcus Hale, was not the man people saw when he shook hands at neighborhood barbecues or chatted politely with coworkers. At first I didn't even know what to say. Marcus had always seemed calm, confident, the kind of guy who drove a dark blue SUV and talked about weekend home projects like he had everything under control. But Claire's voice was shaking when she spoke, and the way she kept glancing toward the window made my stomach twist with a feeling I couldn't explain. That was when she looked straight at me and whispered something I will never forget. She said, "Hannah, I think the only way out of this is if we switch places." At first I thought she was joking, because the idea sounded insane. But then she reached across the table, grabbed my hand, and said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. She said Marcus believed he knew everything about his wife. What he didn't know was that for the next week, the woman walking through his front door wouldn't be Claire at all. I kept replaying Claire's words in my mind as I stood there on the porch pretending to be her, because the truth was that 2 weeks earlier I never would have believed any of this was possible. When Claire first told me about her plan, we were still sitting at my small kitchen table, the one by the window that overlooked the parking lot behind my apartment building. The evening traffic hummed in the distance while the old refrigerator made that quiet clicking noise it always made before turning on again. Claire had wrapped both hands around a mug of tea, even though she had not taken a single sip. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I remember studying her face carefully, because when you grow up with a twin you learn to notice every small difference. Claire had always been the confident one, the sister who made decisions quickly and stuck with them. But that night, she looked like someone who had been carrying a secret for far too long. She started explaining slowly, choosing every word with care, as if saying the wrong thing might somehow make the situation worse. According to everyone else, her marriage to Marcus Hale looked stable and successful. Marcus ran a growing real estate company and had a reputation for being disciplined and organized. Their house sat in a quiet subdivision about 25 miles outside downtown, where every street had neat sidewalks and evenly spaced maple trees. When Claire described their daily life, she did not talk about arguments or dramatic scenes. Instead, she described something much harder to explain. She said Marcus liked control, not in obvious ways that people would question, but in quiet ways that slowly shaped everything around him. He decided when they traveled, which friends they spent time with, and even how the money was managed. At first Claire thought it was simply his personality. Marcus liked order, and she had convinced herself that it was easier to let him handle things. But over time she realized that every decision slowly moved further out of her hands. She stopped choosing where they went for dinner. She stopped making plans without checking with him first. Even small things like visiting me required long conversations that left her feeling strangely guilty for asking. I remember feeling confused as she explained all of this because none of it sounded dramatic enough to match the tension in her voice. Then she said something that finally made everything clear. She said that Marcus believed he understood every part of her routine. He knew when she woke up, where she went after work, which grocery store she preferred, even how she usually responded during disagreements. And that was exactly why the plan might work. Claire looked at me with the same determined expression she used to have before we played a prank on our teachers in high school. She said if someone walked into that house who looked exactly like her, but behaved just slightly differently, Marcus might begin to reveal parts of himself that he normally kept hidden. That was when she leaned forward and lowered her voice and said that because we were twins, there was only one person who could do that. She was asking me to become her for 1 week, and the more I listened, the more I realized she had already made up her mind. For a long moment after Claire told me the plan, I just stared at her across the kitchen table, trying to decide whether what she had suggested was brave or completely insane. The idea of pretending to be my sister might have sounded simple to anyone who had seen us standing side by side, but living inside someone else's life was a very different thing. I asked her the first question that came to my mind, which was why she could not simply leave the situation herself. Claire sighed and leaned back in the chair, looking toward the window as the last orange light of sunset faded behind the buildings outside. She explained that leaving suddenly would create problems she was not ready to face yet. Marcus handled most of their shared finances and many of the legal documents connected to their home and business investments. She wanted time to understand exactly what was happening before making any permanent decision. More than that, she wanted clarity. Claire said she had spent months wondering if she was imagining the tension in her marriage or if something deeper was wrong. She needed to know the truth before she could move forward with confidence. That was where the plan came in. If I stepped into her life for a short period of time, Marcus would believe everything was normal. But because I did not share the same emotional history with him, I might notice details that Claire had slowly become used to. I could ask questions she no longer felt comfortable asking and observe the way he responded. I could see the situation from the outside while still standing inside the house. The more she explained it, the more I understood that this was not about tricking anyone for the sake of drama. Claire simply wanted a clear picture of the life she had been living. Still, the risks felt enormous. I reminded her that Marcus saw her every day. He knew the sound of her voice, the way she walked through the house, the small habits that people develop after years of living together. Claire nodded calmly and told me she had already thought about that. For the next several days we would prepare carefully. She would teach me everything about her routine. Which coffee mug she always used in the morning. Which grocery store she visited on Saturdays. The names of neighbors who liked to stop by for casual conversations. She even began writing down small details that I never would have guessed mattered, like the way Marcus preferred the thermostat set to 71 degrees, or how he expected dinner to be around 6:30 in the evening. As she described these things, I realized how closely someone could study another person's life without anyone else noticing. By the end of the night my head was spinning with information. Claire finally reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. She told me we had spent our entire childhood proving that people could not tell us apart. Now we were going to test whether that was still true. When I finally agreed to help her, neither of us said the part we were both thinking. If Marcus discovered the truth too soon, the entire plan would collapse before we even understood what we were dealing with. The days leading up to the switch felt strangely surreal, like I was rehearsing for a role in a play that had very real consequences. Claire and I spent nearly every evening together going over the details of her life, and the more I learned, the more I realized how carefully structured her routine had become. She started with the small things first, the kind of habits people develop without thinking. Claire always woke up at 6:15 in the morning, not because she enjoyed early mornings, but because Marcus preferred breakfast before leaving for work. She used the same white ceramic mug with a thin blue stripe around the rim and drank exactly 1 cup of coffee with a splash of almond milk. After that, she usually checked her phone for messages while standing near the kitchen island that overlooked the backyard. These might have seemed like insignificant details, but Claire insisted they mattered. She told me Marcus paid attention to routines more than people realized. If something was suddenly different, even something small, he might start asking questions. So we practiced. I walked through her house with her more than once while she pointed out everything from the hallway light switch that tended to stick to the drawer where she kept the extra house keys. She showed me the exact place where Marcus liked to leave his briefcase near the front entry table and explained that he often expected dinner ready around 6:30 in the evening when he returned from the office. Claire even showed me how she usually greeted him at the door, something she had started doing early in their marriage because Marcus liked the sense of routine. At first I felt ridiculous practicing these little moments, but the more we prepared, the more serious it became. Claire also explained the neighbors. Across the street lived a retired couple named Mr. and Mrs. Callahan who walked their golden retriever every afternoon around 5. On the corner was a family with 2 young kids who sometimes rode their bicycles past the house. Claire knew all their names, their schedules, even which holidays they liked to decorate their lawns. It became clear that stepping into her life meant stepping into an entire community that believed they knew her. We also practiced conversation patterns. Claire tended to speak a little more softly than I did, and she paused before answering certain questions because Marcus liked to feel that his opinions carried weight in discussions. It was strange hearing my sister explain these details about her own behavior, almost like she had been studying herself from the outside. One evening, as we sat on her living room couch going over the final notes she had written for me, I asked her the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since this plan began. I asked what would happen if Marcus noticed the difference anyway. Claire looked at me with a calm expression that surprised me. She said that if he noticed anything unusual, I should simply say I was tired or distracted. According to her, Marcus rarely questioned explanations that sounded reasonable. Still, as the night of the switch finally arrived and I drove the 25 miles to her neighborhood with her coat draped over my shoulders and her silver necklace resting against my collarbone, I could not shake the feeling that I was about to step into a life that had far more layers than either of us had fully understood. The sound of the door opening snapped me out of my thoughts before I even realized how long I had been standing there. Marcus Hale appeared in the doorway, taller than I remembered, wearing a dark gray sweater and a calm expression that would have looked perfectly ordinary to anyone else. For a fraction of a second his eyes studied my face, and I felt my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then he stepped aside casually and said, "You are home later than usual tonight, Claire." His voice was steady, almost polite, and that alone told me how convincing our preparation had been because he clearly believed I was his wife. I forced myself to breathe normally and walked past him into the house, hoping my movements looked natural. The inside of the home was exactly how Claire had described it during our long nights of preparation. The entryway opened into a bright living room with tall windows facing the street, and the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingered in the air. Everything looked neat and carefully arranged, from the framed photos on the wall to the polished wooden floors. Marcus closed the door behind me and asked if traffic had been heavy on the highway, the kind of casual question someone might ask after a normal day. I remembered Claire mentioning that she often drove about 25 miles into the city for errands, so I nodded and said that the evening commute had been slower than usual. Marcus accepted the answer without hesitation and walked toward the kitchen, where a soft overhead light illuminated the white countertops and stainless steel appliances. I followed him, trying to keep my posture relaxed the way Claire had shown me. For the next few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. Marcus mentioned a meeting he had attended that afternoon and a new property his company was evaluating outside town. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone used to being in control of conversations. While he talked, I paid attention to everything around me the way Claire had asked. The house felt quiet in a way that was almost too perfect, like every object had been placed exactly where it was expected to be. Marcus opened the refrigerator and glanced inside before looking back at me with a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He asked what I had planned for dinner, the question sounding routine, but carrying a subtle expectation behind it. I remembered Claire telling me he preferred meals at a consistent time, so I answered that I would start preparing something simple right away. Marcus nodded approvingly and leaned casually against the kitchen counter while continuing to talk about his day. As I moved around the kitchen, opening cabinets and pretending to know exactly where everything belonged, I realized that stepping into my sister's life was going to require more than memorizing routines. Marcus observed everything with a quiet attentiveness that made the room feel smaller. Every movement I made felt like part of a test I had not studied enough for. Still, he never once questioned my presence. To him, I was Claire, the woman he believed he understood completely. And as I stood there in the kitchen pretending to belong in a life that was not mine, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If Marcus truly believed he knew every detail about his wife, then sooner or later he was going to notice something that did not match the person he thought he was living with. That first evening passed more smoothly than I expected, but the moment I woke up the next morning inside Claire's house, the reality of what I had agreed to do settled heavily on my mind. The bedroom looked exactly the way she had described it during our preparations, with pale gray walls, wide windows facing the backyard, and a digital clock glowing softly on the nightstand that read 6:14 in the morning. For a few seconds I lay still under the blankets, reminding myself where I was and why I was there. 1 minute later the alarm sounded, a quiet chime that Claire had said Marcus preferred because loud alarms annoyed him. I reached over and turned it off, just as we had practiced. The house was silent, but I knew Marcus would be waking soon. Claire had told me that mornings in this house followed a predictable rhythm, and if I followed that rhythm carefully, there would be less reason for anyone to question anything. I stepped into the kitchen and prepared coffee the same way Claire had shown me, pouring it into the white mug with the thin blue stripe and adding a small splash of almond milk. The clock above the stove read 6:23 when Marcus walked in, dressed in a crisp white shirt with his sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He nodded at me with a polite expression and asked if I had slept well. I answered yes and handed him a cup of coffee the way Claire said she usually did. Marcus thanked me and sat at the kitchen island while scrolling through something on his phone. For several minutes, the only sounds in the room were the quiet tapping of his fingers on the screen and the hum of the refrigerator. It was not uncomfortable exactly, but it carried a kind of tension that felt difficult to explain. Marcus eventually began talking about his schedule for the day. He mentioned a meeting with investors at his office downtown, and said he expected to be back around 6:30 that evening. As he spoke he occasionally looked up at me, not suspiciously, but with the careful attention of someone who liked to observe details. I remembered Claire warning me that Marcus valued routine and subtle order in everything around him. When something changed, even slightly, he tended to notice. That thought stayed with me as the morning continued. Marcus finished his coffee, placed the mug precisely in the sink, and gathered his briefcase from the entry table exactly where Claire said he always left it. Before walking out the door he paused and studied me for a moment with an expression that made my stomach tighten. Then he said something simple but unexpected. He said that I seemed a little quieter than usual that morning. The comment was casual, almost friendly, but it reminded me that even the smallest differences could stand out to someone who believed he understood every detail of another person's behavior. I forced a small smile and told him I had not slept very deeply the night before. Marcus accepted the explanation with a nod and left for work without another question. When the door finally closed behind him, the house fell completely silent again. I stood in the kitchen holding the empty coffee mug and realized that the real challenge of this plan had only just begun. Marcus might believe I was Claire, but he was already paying closer attention than I had hoped. After Marcus left for work that morning, the silence inside the house felt heavier than I expected. For a moment, I simply stood in the kitchen looking around, trying to absorb the reality that for the next several days this place was supposed to be my life. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows facing the backyard, illuminating the spotless countertops and the neat row of cabinets Claire had shown me during our practice nights. Everything looked calm and ordinary, yet I could not shake the feeling that every object in the room somehow belonged to a routine I had only borrowed. I remembered what Claire said before we began this plan. She told me to observe everything carefully, because once you stepped outside your own life, you began noticing details that had once seemed invisible. So I started moving slowly through the house, opening drawers and cabinets exactly the way Claire had described. The pantry contained neatly labeled containers of rice, pasta, and cereal arranged with almost perfect symmetry. The refrigerator shelves were organized by category, with vegetables on the top level, prepared meals in the middle, and drinks lined up evenly on the bottom. Even the hallway closet had folded blankets stacked in precise rows. It was clear that Marcus valued structure in ways that extended far beyond simple tidiness. As the morning passed, I followed the routine Claire had outlined for me. Around 10:30, I drove to the same grocery store she usually visited on Fridays, about 5 miles from the house. I walked through the aisles pushing the cart slowly while reviewing the list Claire had given me. Several employees greeted me politely and called me by Claire's name, which reminded me how deeply rooted she was in this neighborhood. Every small interaction felt like another quiet test. By early afternoon, I returned home and prepared a light lunch before spending time reviewing the notes Claire had written about Marcus's schedule and habits. Most of the information seemed straightforward, but one detail caught my attention more than the others. According to Claire, Marcus disliked unexpected changes, especially when they involved plans he had already arranged. That thought lingered in my mind as the afternoon sun began to fade behind the trees outside the window. Around 6:20 that evening, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My pulse quickened as I walked toward the front entry, just like Claire usually did. When Marcus stepped through the door, he looked composed as always, placing his briefcase neatly on the small table by the wall. He greeted me with the same calm expression he had worn the night before, but something about the way his eyes moved across the room suggested he was studying the environment more carefully than before. As we sat down for dinner, he mentioned a phone call he had received earlier from one of his business partners. The conversation sounded routine at first, but then Marcus said something that made me pause. He casually mentioned that people often underestimated how much you could learn about someone simply by paying attention to patterns. According to him, routines revealed everything about a person if you watch long enough. He said it almost like a lesson he had learned through experience. I forced myself to keep eating normally, but inside my mind a quiet realization began to form. If Marcus truly believed that patterns revealed the truth about people, then the smallest mistake in my performance could eventually expose the entire plan. That night after dinner, Marcus stayed at the table longer than usual, slowly sipping a glass of water while looking thoughtfully toward the window. I kept reminding myself to stay calm and follow the routine Claire had practiced with me, clearing the plates and placing them carefully in the dishwasher exactly the way she said Marcus preferred. The house felt unusually quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the living room. Marcus eventually stood up and walked into his home office, a room Claire had mentioned but told me I probably would not enter. The door remained slightly open, and I could hear the low murmur of his voice as he made a phone call. I was not trying to listen, but when you are living inside someone else's life, every sound feels important. I caught a few fragments of the conversation, mostly business terms and property addresses, until one sentence made me pause. Marcus said something about how people often reveal more about themselves when they believe no one is watching closely. The comment seemed casual, yet it echoed the same idea he mentioned earlier about patterns and observation. When the call ended, he stepped back into the living room and leaned against the doorframe with a thoughtful expression. For a moment, he simply watched me as I wiped down the kitchen counter. Then he asked a question that felt ordinary but carried a subtle weight behind it. He asked whether I had spoken with my sister recently. My heart skipped for an instant, but I remembered Claire had warned me that Marcus occasionally asked about our family. I answered that I had not spoken with Hannah in a few days because she had been busy with work. Marcus nodded slowly, almost as if measuring the answer before accepting it. He then mentioned that he always found it interesting how twins could be so alike and yet still have completely different lives. According to him, small differences in choices eventually shaped everything about a person's path. I responded carefully, agreeing that life often moves people in unexpected directions. Marcus studied my face for a brief moment before giving a faint smile and saying that he had always believed he understood Claire very well. He said that when you live with someone long enough, you learn their habits, their tone of voice, even the rhythm of their daily thoughts. Hearing him say that sent a quiet wave of tension through me, but I forced myself to remain composed. Marcus eventually walked toward the staircase, pausing halfway up to say he had an early meeting in the morning and planned to review some documents before bed. After he disappeared into the hallway upstairs, I remained standing in the kitchen, staring at the reflection of the room in the dark window. The plan Claire and I created had seemed clever when we first imagined it at my apartment table. But now that I was inside this house, surrounded by routines Marcus believed he knew perfectly, the situation felt far more delicate than either of us predicted. And as I turned off the kitchen lights and prepared to follow him upstairs, one thought repeated quietly in my mind. If Marcus truly believed he understood every detail about his wife, Then the moment he realized something was different might arrive sooner than either of us expected. The moment everything finally shifted came 3 evenings later, and it happened so quietly that at first I almost missed it. By that point I had settled into Claire's routine well enough that even I sometimes forgot I was pretending. Each morning began with the same early alarm, the same white mug with the blue stripe, and the same calm conversations over coffee while Marcus reviewed messages on his phone. Every evening he returned around 6:30, placed his briefcase on the entry table, and asked about dinner in the same steady voice. From the outside the house still looked like the orderly life everyone believed Claire lived. But over those days I began noticing something Claire had struggled to explain before. Marcus paid attention to details in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like quiet measurement. He often asked small questions about my day that sounded casual, but seemed designed to confirm whether my answers matched the routine he expected. For a while I managed to follow Claire's patterns carefully, enough that nothing seemed unusual. Then on that third evening Marcus came home slightly earlier than normal. I heard the front door open while I was still finishing dinner in the kitchen, and his footsteps paused in the entryway longer than usual. When he walked into the room his expression looked thoughtful rather than suspicious, which somehow made the moment feel even more serious. He sat down at the kitchen island and watched me move around the stove before saying something that made my heart slow for a second. He said that he had been thinking about something all afternoon. According to him, people often believe they understand those closest to them completely, but sometimes a small difference in behavior can reveal that there is more happening beneath the surface. I placed the plates on the table as calmly as I could and asked what he meant. Marcus smiled faintly and explained that over the past few days he had noticed that I seemed slightly more confident when speaking about certain topics. He said it was not a bad change, just unexpected. Then he added something that confirmed the realization Claire and I had both been waiting for. Marcus said that sometimes distance allows people to see their own lives more clearly, and perhaps Claire had simply started seeing things from a new perspective. Hearing him say that felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Marcus believed he was witnessing his wife slowly changing, but the truth was far simpler. He had been observing someone who had never lived inside his carefully controlled routine before. I realized in that moment that our plan had already done what Claire hoped it would do. By stepping into her life, I had disrupted the pattern Marcus believed he understood perfectly. That disruption had forced him to reveal the quiet assumptions he carried about control and familiarity. Later that night, after Marcus went upstairs to review documents in his office, I stepped outside onto the back patio and called Claire. The cool night air moved gently through the trees while I told her everything I had seen and heard over the past several days. Claire listened quietly before letting out a long breath that sounded lighter than any I had heard from her before. She finally understood something important about her life. The routine she thought she had to follow was never as unchangeable as it seemed. And as I looked back toward the softly lit windows of the house, I realized that the moment Marcus began noticing those small differences was the moment Claire's life had already started to change.